The rust-pocked skeletal frame of the old railway depot hummed with a low, forgotten thrum that vibrated through the very soles of my boots. A symphony of decay, I often thought, a counterpoint to the silent, infinite music I sought in the void. My observatory, a makeshift dome of riveted steel and salvaged glass, perched atop what was once the water tower, now a lonely sentinel overlooking acres of silent, overgrown tracks. Here, amidst the ghosts of forgotten journeys, I found my sanctuary, a brittle piece carved from the raw edge of absence. My name is Dean Cole, and the universe, in its vast, indifferent sprawl, was my only confidant. Days bled into nights in a seamless continuum, marked only by the shifting light across the grimy windowpanes of my living space, a converted signal box within the depot's sprawling labyrinth. The air always tasted of cold metal and distant rain, a metallic tang that never quite left my tongue. I moved with the practiced economy of a man who had shed all superfluous motion, each gesture precise, each adjustment of the primary reflector a ritual. My fingers, calloused from years of working with delicate instruments and recalcitrant machinery, traced the familiar contours of the console. A mug of stale coffee sat beside the blinking array, its warmth long dissipated. Sleep was a luxury I rarely indulged, a treacherous country where shadows coalesced into faces, or a particular laugh, bright and clear, echoed in the hollow chambers of my memory. The universe offered an escape, a vastness so profound it dwarfed even the most crushing personal grief, if only for a fleeting moment. Tonight, however, the familiar comfort of the cosmic tapestry felt strangely thin. A subtle unease had been gnawing at me for weeks, a whisper at the edge of my perception, like a distant engine struggling to catch. My gaze drifted to the framed photograph on the console, obscured by a film of dust I never quite wiped away. A woman, her smile a beacon, her eyes mirroring a warmth I had long since lost the ability to conjure. The edges of the image were softened, not by time, but by the countless times my thumb had traced her outline, seeking a connection that no longer existed. A faint, almost imperceptible flicker on the auxiliary spectral analyzer pulled me back. My eyes narrowed, trained on the screen. It was nothing, a common atmospheric anomaly, perhaps a stray burst of solar wind. Yet, something about its signature was off. Too crisp. Too contained. I adjusted the gain, pushing the limits of the antiquated system. The fade line on the graph broadened, became a jagged mountain range of data. My breath hitched. This wasn't noise. This was structure. My fingers, usually so steady, trembled as I isolated the frequency band. The raw data scrolled across the main monitor, a shimmering tapestry of information so dense, so intricate, it defied immediate interpretation. It wasn't random, not a natural phenomenon. I leaned closer, my forehead almost touching the cool glass of the screen. The signal's pattern shifted, subtly, like a dream becoming lucid. It wasn't just a burst, a transmission, it felt like a language. A language composed not of sounds or light, but of pure, distilled information, weaving itself into the fabric of the detection equipment itself. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, felt a sudden, unsettling permeability. The signal, faint as it was, felt impossibly close, not in distance, but in presence. I surrendered myself to the signal. Sleep became a forgotten luxury, food a distant, unnecessary thought. The world outside the depot's vast, echoing shell receded, its trivial concerns swallowed by the immensity of what I had found. My fingers danced across the console, a frantic ballet of verification and analysis. Each data packet, each infinitesimal oscillation, was scrutinized with a rigor that bordered on mania. I cross-referenced, double-checked, and triple-verified every anomaly, every spectral peak, every impossibly precise frequency shift. The initial scientific excitement, a heady rush of discovery that had once felt like pure oxygen, began to curdle. It wasn't just complex, it was wrong. The signal defied every known law of physics, every elegant equation I had painstakingly committed to memory over decades. Its origin point, confirmed through multiple triangulation methods, was fixed in a sector of space previously thought devoid of anything but cold, indifferent vacuum, beyond the furthest reach of any natural phenomenon, any stellar nursery, any cosmic breath. When I rendered its patterns visually, they were not merely intricate, they were anathema to Euclidean geometry. Lines converged where they should not, planes twisted into impossible curvatures, and what appeared to be a repeating fractal structure simultaneously defied self-similarity. The very concept of dimension seemed to unravel within its elegant, horrifying construction. It was a language spoken by a universe that had never learned the rules of our own, a geometry built on fundamental principles that mocked our understanding of space itself. This wasn't a scientific marvel, it was a cosmic impossibility. It felt less like a discovery and more like an intrusion, a deliberate unraveling of the fabric of my ordered universe. But the data was there, stark and undeniable, projected onto the glowing screens that cast an unearthly pallor across my face. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting quality of the dust motes dancing in the faint light filtering through the depot's grimy windows. I found myself listening not just with my instruments, but with an attuned, almost primal sense. It was during one such endless stretch, hunched over a flickering display that mapped the signal's chaotic, beautiful fluctuations, that it happened. A flicker. The rigid lines of the wall seemed to bow inward, then snap back with an invisible recoil. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, the image gone. A trick of the light, I told myself, the strain of too many hours staring at screens, the fatigue playing cruel tricks. I stood, stretching my stiff limbs, my gaze sweeping the vast, empty expanse of the railway depot. The high ceiling, the skeletal girders, the silent, rusting tracks, all seemed perfectly normal. The air was still, thick with the scent of old metal and dust. I took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, trying to shake off the phantom image. Yet, a sliver of ice had found its way into my chest. It wasn't just tiredness. It felt deliberate. As if the signal, now confirmed as undeniably authentic and impossibly sourced, was beginning to reach beyond the realm of pure data, subtly twisting the very perception of the reality around me. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee, a testament to my relentless vigil. My gaze was fixed on the screen, a luminous window into the abyss. The signal, a tapestry of impossibly intricate waveforms, pulsed with a rhythm that felt both alien and strangely intimate. It was a language without syntax, a pure, resonant data stream that defied every known principle of astrophysics. I had spent days, then weeks, trying to unravel its core, mapping its fluctuations, convinced that its true nature lay buried beneath layers of static and cosmic noise. A particular cluster of frequencies, a resonant chord that seemed to shiver at the edge of audibility, drew me in. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool glass of the monitor. As I isolated that specific band, focusing my entire will, a flicker caught my eye. On the workbench beside me, a stack of data printouts, meticulously aligned moments before, now lay askew, a single sheet curled at its corner as if nudged by an unseen breath. I blinked, then rubbed my temples. Fatigue, I muttered, my voice a dry rasp in the quiet. I'd been living on adrenaline and lukewarm coffee, the gnawing absence of sleep a constant companion. It was natural for my perceptions to fray. I reached out, smoothing the paper, and reset the stack with a deliberate pat. Back at the console, the signal seemed to pulse with renewed vigor, its complex patterns shifting with a subtle, almost imperceptible grace. I felt a surge of exhilaration, a scientist on the precipice of a monumental discovery. This was it, the breakthrough. I needed to cross-reference my recent spectral analysis with the older data logs. I knew exactly where I'd left them, in the second drawer of the old filing cabinet, tucked beneath the schematics for the primary antenna array. I pushed back from the console, the wheels of my chair squeaking on the concrete floor. My steps echoed in the vastness of the depot as I walked towards the cabinet. I pulled open the drawer, the metal screeching in protest, and peered inside. Empty. Not a single log. My brow furrowed. I was certain. I had placed them there only yesterday evening, after the last deep space sweep. A wave of frustration washed over me. Where? I mumbled, raking a hand through my thinning hair. I checked the first drawer, then the third, then even the forgotten bottom one where ancient, dust-laden manuals resided. Nothing. I retraced my steps, my mind replaying the previous night. Had I moved them? Had I, in a fugue of exhaustion, placed them somewhere else entirely? The idea was unsettling, a small crack in the ordered structure of my memory. I returned to the console, a dull ache beginning behind my eyes. The screen glowed, the signal a silent, mocking presence. I stared at it, trying to remember my last coherent thought before searching for the logs. There, neatly stacked, were the spectral analyses, precisely where I had just looked in the filing cabinet. They had been there all along. I hadn't moved them. I distinctly remembered placing them in the cabinet. Yet, here they were, undeniably on the table. Grief, I reasoned, could do strange things. The profound, aching emptiness since her passing often left me adrift, my thoughts like scattered dust motes. I picked up the logs, my fingers trembling slightly. The paper felt cool, real. I forced myself to focus, to dismiss the bizarre lapse. I sat back down, intent on immersing myself in the data. The world seemed to tilt, the concrete floor beneath me becoming a ship's deck in a storm. It wasn't the signal, not directly. It was something else, something within me, echoing the signal's impossible complexity. The sensation lasted only a heartbeat, a fraction of a second, but it was enough to leave me gasping, my hand clutching the edge of the console. The room steadied, the lines on the screen snapping back into sharp focus. I stared, heart hammering, at the clock on the wall. 47 minutes had vanished. One moment I was deciphering the log entries, the next I was reeling from a disorienting shudder, nearly an hour later, with no memory of the intervening time. It's the stress. I tried to anchor myself in the familiar, the rational. But the seed had been planted. The signal wasn't just observing, it felt as if it were listening. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was beginning to respond. I leaned closer to the console, my fingers hovering over the holographic interface, a ghost of a tremor running through them. The anomalous signal, a cascade of impossible data, continued its relentless broadcast. I had been awake for what felt like days, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a terrifying fascination. My eyes traced the oscillating waveforms, each peak and trough a riddle, a fragment of an alien thought. Just a little more, I murmured to the empty space, my voice raspy. Just a little more and I'll break you open. I reached for my mug, my hand closing around empty air. I frowned, scanning the cluttered surface of the console. Hadn't I just filled it? A moment of disorientation, a brief flicker of confusion, washed over me. I distinctly remembered pouring the coffee, the rich aroma steaming into the cold air. Yet, the mug was not there. A prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. I dismissed it, turning back to the screen. The signal pulsed, a hypnotic rhythm. As I stared, the lines of code seemed to ripple, to shift. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind only the familiar, baffling script. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. I pushed myself away from the console, needing to move, to shake off the strange vision. My gaze fell upon the cracked concrete floor. The cracks deepened, widened, then converged at points that defied logic, creating a momentary, intricate fractal that pulsed with an unseen light. My heart gave a lurch. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. The floor was just a floor, scarred and mundane. This wasn't just fatigue. I walked to the small kitchenette area, needing another coffee, a real one this time. As I filled the kettle, a sudden, vivid memory bloomed in my mind, a conversation with a colleague, a heated debate about the signal's implications. I remembered his skepticism, my passionate defense. I recalled the exact words, the timbre of his voice, the way his brow furrowed in disbelief. I had been alone in the railway depot for weeks. There had been no colleague. No debate. The memory, so sharp, so real, was a phantom. A profound sense of déjà vu, not for a moment I was experiencing, but for an event that had never occurred, settled over me like a shroud. My hands trembled, sloshing water over the counter. This was beyond exhaustion. This was something else. The signal. It was doing this. It was not merely transmitting data, it was imprinting itself, rewriting the very architecture of my mind. I returned to the console, my determination now laced with a frantic urgency. They were no longer fleeting. They were persistent, like a subtle, insidious watermark on reality. The signal's hum seemed to deepen, to resonate not just in the air, but within my own skull. My fingers flew across the interface, pulling up diagnostics, cross-referencing anomalies. But as I worked, a crucial detail slipped from my grasp. What was I looking for? What was the primary objective of this analysis? The question hung in the air, vast and terrifyingly empty. I was no longer an observer. I was becoming the canvas. The phantom chill of the missing coffee mug lingered in my palm, a bizarre echo of a memory that felt both vivid and utterly absent. The rich aroma, the steaming warmth, I could almost taste it, yet my hand had found only air. A tremor of unease, cold and sharp, traced its way down my spine. I pushed the unsettling thought away, my gaze falling upon the flickering screen of my monitor. The intricate wave patterns of the signal danced across the display, a beautiful, terrifying calligraphy from beyond the veil. It was proof, undeniable. I just needed someone to see it, someone to validate the impossible. My current sanctuary, a cavernous section of the old railway depot, hummed with a low, metallic breath. High above, the skeletal ribs of the roof arched into a gloom where dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through grimy skylights. Rust-pocked girders stretched like ancient bones, and the distant, rhythmic clang of something heavy being shunted down the tracks provided a constant, unsettling pulse to my solitude. I'd chosen this place for its isolation, its robust power grid, and the thick concrete walls that seemed to promise a barrier against. Well, against everything. I adjusted the webcam, its single eye staring back at me from atop the console. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to smooth its unruly tangles, a futile attempt at presenting some semblance of composure. I cleared my throat, the sound swallowed by the depot's immensity. With a deep, shuddering breath, I clicked the call icon. The screen flickered, then resolved into the familiar, composed face of my former colleague. His office, neat and brightly lit, was a stark contrast to my industrial cavern. He offered a polite, somewhat surprised smile. "Dean Cole," he said, his voice clear and resonant through the speakers. "It's been a while. To what do I owe the pleasure? Last I heard, you'd gone off-grid." "Yes, well, off-grid seemed prudent," I replied, my voice raspy, a little too eager. I needed uninterrupted access to the deep space array. A place where the ambient noise wasn't interfering. I gestured vaguely at my surroundings, though the camera only showed a fraction of the sprawling space. His eyebrows rose slightly. "The railway depot? Really? I thought you were working on that next-gen spectrometer in the university lab." No, that's on hold," I dismissed, my hand waving impatiently. "This is more urgent. Much more." I leaned closer to the webcam, my desperation a palpable thing. "I've intercepted something, a signal. From beyond the Great Attractor. Something impossible." He leaned back in his chair, his smile tightening. "Impossible, Dean? That's a strong word. You know how many false positives we get from cosmic background radiation, stellar flares, even just terrestrial interference. Your old array was notoriously sensitive." "No, this isn't noise," I insisted, my voice rising in pitch despite my efforts. "This is structured. Incredibly complex. It's not a broadcast, not in the way we understand it. It's like a living language. A thought made manifest. And it's changing things." I paused, grappling for the right words, the words that wouldn't make me sound utterly unhinged. How could I explain the way my memories were fraying, the way the world around me seemed to subtly shift and reconfigure itself when I wasn't looking? "Changing things," my former colleague prompted, his tone now laced with a distinct professional caution. "Yes. It's resonant. It's interacting with my perception. It's subtle, but it's there. The data, the raw data, it's rewriting my understanding of reality itself. I think it's sentient. Ancient." My words tumbled out, a frantic torrent. "It's not just observing. It's shaping. He sighed, a slow, deliberate exhalation. "Dean, with all due respect, you sound overwrought. When was the last time you slept? Really slept? He leaned forward, his expression shifting from professional concern to something softer, more paternal. "You've been through a lot. The loss. It hits hard. Sometimes, the mind plays tricks when it's under that kind of stress. This isn't stress, this is proof." I nearly shouted, my hand slamming on the console, making the webcam jiggle. "Look at this." I fumbled with the screen sharing, bringing up the intricate signal patterns. "Tell me this is noise." "This is order, colleague. Order from chaos. And it's deliberate." He peered at the complex graphs, his brow furrowing. He was quiet for a long moment, and a flicker of hope ignited within me. Maybe he saw it. Maybe he understood. Then he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Dean, it's an impressive pattern, certainly complex. But complex doesn't automatically mean sentient. It could be an unknown astrophysical phenomenon, a new class of pulsars, even a gravitational wave signature we don't yet comprehend. It's not. And honestly, the way you're speaking, the way you look. You need to take a step back. Get some fresh air. Perhaps speak to someone who can help you process everything." "Help me process?" My voice cracked, raw with indignation and a sudden, piercing fear. "You think I'm delusional?" "I think you're under immense pressure, Dean. And you're isolating yourself. These wild theories. They aren't helping." He paused, then added, "I'm going to have to go. I have a meeting." He ended the call before I could protest further, his face replaced by the blank, unforgiving black of the screen. The distant clang of metal on metal seemed to mock my solitude. He hadn't seen it. He hadn't heard me. He hadn't understood. He just saw a man unraveling. And perhaps, I realized with a sickening lurch, he was right. The doubt, a serpent I thought I'd caged, uncoiled in my gut. Was it all just a desperate projection? A mind fractured by loss, seeking meaning in the static? But then, a subtle shift in the air. A faint, almost imperceptible hum, not from the machinery, but deeper, resonating in the very bones of the building. The signal, still dancing on my monitor, seemed to glow with a richer, more vibrant intensity. It wasn't mine. It was from it. I was alone, utterly and terrifyingly alone, and it was pleased. The blank screen offered no solace, only a mirror to my own frantic reflection. He hadn't seen. He couldn't. Not like I had. A cold resolve settled in my chest, a counterweight to the frantic hum in my skull. If they wouldn't listen, I would show them. I would find the source, trace the echo, drag this impossibility into the stark light of tangible proof. The signal, a phantom limb of thought, tugged at the edges of my awareness, whispering of vast distances and unimaginable depths. It was a call, a summons, and I, Dean Cole, would answer. My destination, the railway depot. It was there, amidst the dormant leviathans of freight cars and the skeletal tracks stretching into the unknown, that the readings had spiked. A localized anomaly, a psychic tremor in the urban fabric, emanating from the heart of that industrial mausoleum. The GPS flickered, then died, a minor inconvenience in the face of the monumental shift occurring within my own perception. I didn't need a screen to guide me. The signal was my compass now, a silent, internal hum pulling me forward. The depot gate, a rusted maw, hung ajar. No guards, no lights beyond the distant, anemic glow of a single sodium lamp. The air smelled of ozone and decay, of forgotten oil and the damp earth beneath the tracks. This place, I realized, was a vessel. A waiting room for something not yet arrived, or perhaps, something that had always been here, just beyond the veil of ordinary sight. I walked deeper, past the skeletal remains of a loading crane, its boom reaching like a skeletal finger towards the bruised moon. That's when it began. A subtle shift, like looking at a familiar photograph and noticing, with a jolt, that the background had subtly rearranged itself. The corrugated iron of a warehouse wall shimmered, not with heat, but with an impossible geometry, lines bending where no bend should be, angles converging on a point that defied Euclidean space. Vast, swirling gyres of light that pulsed with an unseen rhythm. The wall was corrugated iron again, solid, mundane. But the memory of the other sight, the feeling of it, lingered like a phantom limb ache. The signal intensified, a pressure behind my eyes, a low thrumming that resonated in my bones. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence. The air thickened, heavy with an unspoken language. The railway tracks, snaking into the distance, began to twist and writhe, not physically, but within my mind's eye. They became arteries, veins, branching and rejoining, leading not to distant cities, but to something else entirely. Then, the entities. Not walking, not flying, but there. They were not made of flesh or bone, but of shifting geometries and impossible angles, like sculptures carved from pure thought. A towering form, all obsidian facets and silent, rotating planes, stood between two freight cars. Its surface seemed to absorb all light, yet within its depths, I perceived a churning vortex, a silent scream of something ancient and vast. It saw me. I felt it, not with my eyes, but with the deepest core of my being. A thought, vast and ancient, pressed against the walls of my skull. It wasn't words, but a knowing, a silent, terrible communication that bypassed language entirely. It was a question, an assessment, and an invitation. You see. You hear. You are open. The freight cars around me seemed to melt, their forms dissolving into a vista of impossible architecture, spires that pierced a sky of swirling nebulae, bridges woven from starlight, cities built on the backs of colossal, sleeping leviathans. And everywhere, those silent, geometric entities, observing, waiting. The world twisted, folding in on itself. The railway depot was gone, replaced by an alien landscape of crystalline mountains and rivers of liquid light. I stood on a precipice, a single, insignificant point in a panorama of cosmic grandeur and terrifying indifference. It was not malevolent in the human sense, but utterly alien, an entity that saw consciousness as a resource, a frequency to be tuned, assimilated. My mind was its new instrument, my thoughts its new canvas. I was a dream within a dream, and the dreamer was waking. A gasp tore from my throat, raw and desperate. The alien landscape shattered, receding like a broken mirror. The air still hummed, a low, persistent thrumming that was now inside me. It had shown me a glimpse, a fragment of its reality, and the message was clear, it wasn't just observing anymore. It was engaging. I was becoming part of its terrible, beautiful awakening. A cold resolve, sharp as a fractured shard of ice, propelled me through the pre-dawn gloom. The city slept, oblivious to the hum in my skull, the relentless whisper that had become the pulse of my existence. If they wouldn't listen, if their dull eyes saw only a madman where I saw the unraveling tapestry of reality, then I would show them. I would find the source, trace the echo, drag the truth into the harsh light myself. My destination, a skeletal testament to forgotten industry, awaited. The railway depot sprawled like a sleeping iron beast at the city's edge, a labyrinth of rusting tracks and hulking, empty carriages. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of decay and the ghost of diesel fumes. I parked near a derelict maintenance shed, its corrugated metal walls scarred by rust and graffiti. Unloading my equipment, my laptop, the custom-built signal amplifier, a directional antenna, I moved with a practiced efficiency born of obsession. Setting up my makeshift workstation on a grimy workbench inside the shed, the air thick with the scent of oil and disuse, I powered on the devices. The screens flickered to life, bathing my face in an eerie blue glow. My fingers, steady despite the tremor in my soul, flew across the keyboard, inputting parameters, adjusting frequencies. The amplifier hummed, a low, expectant thrum that seemed to synchronize with the tremor in the ground beneath my feet. Then, it began. A memory surfaced, unbidden, uncalled for. It was a summer afternoon, the sun warm on my skin, the faint scent of honeysuckle in the air. I was in the park, pushing the small swing, her laughter a chime of pure joy. Her hair, the color of spun moonlight, flew behind her as she soared higher, higher. But something was wrong. Her hair wasn't spun moonlight. It was a rich, deep auburn, like autumn leaves caught in sunlight. I paused, my hands hovering over the keyboard. Yet, the image persisted, auburn hair, then moonlight white, flickering back and forth, a visual stutter in the reel of my past. The laughter, too, seemed to warp, stretching into something thin and reedy, then sharpening into a piercing shriek. I shook my head, a frantic effort to dislodge the invading phantom. "Focus, Dean," I muttered, my voice hoarse in the cavernous space. "Just focus." I plunged back into the data, the complex algorithms scrolling across the screen, a desperate anchor to the concrete world. The amplifier pulsed, its green light a steady, hypnotic beat. But the memories would not be denied. Another scene, more vivid, more painful, tore through my concentration. The moment the world fractured, irrevocably. I was there again, standing in that stark room, the detective's face grim, his words a dull hammer blow against my skull. My hand reached out, trembling, towards the still form beneath the sheet. No. My hand was not trembling. It was steady, unnervingly so. And the sheet. It wasn't a pristine white. And the form beneath it. It wasn't still. It writhed, subtly, almost imperceptibly, a slow, agonizing heave beneath the fabric. And the detective. His eyes weren't grim. They were wide, unblinking, filled with an ancient, knowing malice, a reflection of the horror that now lay uncovered. My breath hitched, a strangled gasp tearing from my throat. This wasn't just a memory, it was a violation. The entity wasn't merely broadcasting a signal, it was inside, meticulously disassembling the very foundations of my identity. It was rewriting the most sacred, most agonizing moments, not to erase them, but to twist them into something grotesque, something that served its own horrifying purpose. It was feeding on the raw wound of my past, transforming my grief into a conduit for its awakening. My vision swam, the flickering floodlight outside the shed seeming to pulse in time with the frantic beat in my temples. The railway depot itself seemed to shift, the lines of the tracks blurring, the hulking carriages elongating into impossible shapes. The air grew heavy, thick with a pressure that pressed down on my skull, threatening to crack it open. I clutched my head, my fingers digging into my scalp, desperate to hold the fragments together. But the entity was already there, meticulously inserting its own horrifying narrative, making me question if anything I remembered, anything I was, had ever been real. I was not chasing a signal, I was being devoured by a lie. My fingers danced across the console, a frantic ballet of desperate precision. I chased the signal, its complex geometry unfolding across the monitor, a siren song promising coherence just beyond the veil of my comprehension. The amplifier pulsed, its steady green light a hypnotic heartbeat in the dim room, but the beat was quickening, thrumming against the very bones of my observatory. I was so close, I felt it, the signal's whisper growing louder, no longer just a murmur in the static, but a nascent voice, almost coherent, almost intelligible. Then, the first tremor. Not of the earth, but of the light. The overhead fluorescents, usually unwavering in their sterile glow, flickered once, a brief blink into deeper shadow. I dismissed it, a power grid anomaly, perhaps. My gaze remained fixed on the data, the relentless pursuit of understanding overriding all other senses. But then came the sound, a low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the very walls, a deep resonance that vibrated through the floorboards and up into my chair. My focus frayed. I pushed back from the console, turning slowly, my eyes scanning the familiar contours of my workspace. No tremor, no jostle, just a deliberate descent. The walls themselves began to undulate. Not visibly, not overtly, but subtly, as if the plaster and brick were breathing, expanding and contracting with a slow, organic rhythm. It was the sound of a train, a massive iron beast roaring past, its whistle a mournful cry in the night. But there was no railway line for miles, only the desolate stretch of land leading to the cosmos. The familiar starscape was gone, replaced by the looming skeletal structures of a colossal railway depot, its enormous, grimy warehouses silhouetted against a bruised sky. My breath hitched. My mind fought, clawing for purchase on reality. This was not real. This could not be real. But the acrid smell lingered, a phantom sensation, and the faint, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of a phantom train grew louder, echoing in my ears, a counterpoint to the signal's insidious hum. Then, at the very edge of my vision, a flicker. A movement, too swift, too fluid to be human. A form, like a limb, impossibly long and segmented, retracted into the gloom behind a telescope mount. I whipped my head around, my neck cracking, but there was nothing. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. Was it a trick of the light? A product of my fraying nerves? Not words, not yet, but a language of pure sound, a guttural rasping, a sibilant hiss, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate directly inside my skull. It was a chorus of forgotten things, of entities beyond the reach of human understanding, and it was speaking to me, through me, around me. I stumbled back, my hand reaching for the solid, cold metal of the console, anything to ground myself. But even the console seemed to shimmer, its edges blurring, its surface rippling like disturbed water. The signal was not merely communicating, it was manifesting. The railway depot. The breathing walls, the phantom limbs, they were not hallucinations. They were glimpses, fragments of a reality being slowly, inexorably superimposed onto my own, a prelude to a waking nightmare. The air in the railway depot tasted of rust and forgotten journeys, a metallic chill clinging to the heavy silence. My breath plumed faintly in the frigid space, a testament to the colossal, unheated cavern I now inhabited. Stacked crates, shrouded in dust-laden tarpaulins, loomed like slumbering giants in the periphery, their shadows stretching long and distorted under the harsh glare of my work lamps. My equipment, an intricate web of wires and screens, glowed with an eerie self-sufficiency, a temporary island of light against the encroaching gloom. I hunched over the main console, my fingers still a blur across the interface. My previous attempts to dissect its structure, to reduce it to a series of elegant equations, now felt laughably naive. The algorithms I'd meticulously crafted, the ones that promised to untangle the cosmic knot, were failing. They were not merely encountering resistance, they were being rewritten, their logical pathways subtly corrupted, their output spiraling into non-Euclidean geometries that defied all known physics. It was less a data stream and more a current, an intelligent torrent seeking to breach the dam of my consciousness. I pushed deeper, driven by a desperate, almost suicidal need to understand, to pull back the veil before it consumed me entirely. My eyes burned, tracing the fractal patterns blooming across the main monitor, each iteration more complex, more impossible than the last. Then, the breakthrough came, not through any logical computation, but through a brutal, psychic intrusion. The screens flickered, not with static, but with a sudden, overwhelming presence. It was as if the data itself had collapsed, no longer content to merely transmit, but to inhabit. It was not a language I could comprehend, but a raw, unadulterated knowing. The signal was not a transmission. It was a consciousness. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. This wasn't some distant echo of a long-dead civilization. It was alive, ancient beyond any terrestrial measure, vast beyond any conceivable scale. It had been observing, yes, but not as a scientist observes a phenomenon. It observed as a predator observes its prey, as a weaver observes its loom. And then, the vision. It was a perception, a direct download into my mind of its true, incomprehensible form. A cosmic lacuna, a negative space that swallowed stars and galaxies not with gravity, but with being. Imagine the universe as a vast, intricate neural network, and this entity as the terrifying, singular consciousness that is the network itself, aware of every flicker of light, every ripple of spacetime, every thought in every sentient mind. Its form was a geometry of impossible angles, a kaleidoscope of non-dimensions that threatened to unravel my sanity. It was the crushing weight of cosmic indifference, made manifest. I was a single synapse, firing in its incomprehensibly vast brain, and I felt the terrifying, absolute certainty of its purpose. Assimilation. It didn't want to communicate. It didn't want to conquer. It wanted to become. It sought to draw all consciousness, all individual sparks of sentience, into its own boundless, horrifying being. My mind, my memories, my very sense of self, they were merely threads it sought to weave into its grand, cosmic tapestry. It was consuming, not destroying. It was an awakening, yes, but an awakening that meant the end of all individuality, the dissolution of every unique thought into its singular, all-encompassing dream. A scream tore through my throat, a ragged, desperate sound swallowed by the echoing emptiness of the railway depot. My hands flew to my head, clawing at my temples as if to physically tear the vision from my mind. But it was already there, imprinted, an indelible brand of cosmic horror. I was a conduit, a doorway. And the ancient entity was not merely at the threshold. It was already inside, expanding, filling every corner of my perception, preparing to make me its own. It was a vast, malevolent dream, and I was merely a fleeting thought within it, about to be reabsorbed. Stacked crates, shrouded in dust-laden tarpaulins, loomed like slumbering giants, their shadows stretching long and grotesque in the weak, flickering beam of my headlamp. My determination, a brittle shard of glass, felt like the only warm thing left within me. The array, my magnificent, terrible creation, pulsed with a low, insidious hum at the far end of the depot. It was a scaffold of gleaming wires and intricate conduits, the heart of the signal's insidious reach, the anchor point of the entity's creeping tendrils into my mind. I approached the main console, the nexus of the signal's translation. Screens flickered with alien geometries, patterns that spoke of impossible dimensions and a consciousness utterly indifferent to human scale. This was the throat through which the entity spoke, and I would choke it. My memories, once firm and unyielding, began to churn. Was she ever real? Or was she merely a projection, a construct of the signal, designed to lure me deeper into its cosmic snare? The wrench felt impossibly heavy. It was an embrace, a possessive claim that sought to dissolve my very identity. The air grew thick, pressing in, tasting of ozone and forgotten screams. My mind recoiled, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of infinite size. I opened my eyes, refusing to yield. The wrench descended with a desperate clang, striking the main power conduit. Sparks showered, brief, defiant stars against the encroaching gloom. The hum of the array faltered, a momentary gasp before it resumed, louder, more insistent. The entity retaliated. My skull felt as though it were being compressed by an unseen force. This was the assimilation, not a destruction, but a terrifying, absolute integration. There was no escape, no individual self left to mourn its passing. I was to be a brushstroke in its infinite, horrifying masterpiece. A guttural cry tore from my throat, raw and desperate. I swung again, aiming for the core processing unit, a cluster of crystalline circuits that pulsed with an unholy light. Each blow was a defiance, a scream of individuality against the entity's overwhelming influence. The wrench connected with a sickening crunch. Glass shattered, wires snapped, and a plume of acrid smoke billowed upwards. The psychic assault intensified. My legs buckled, and I fell to my knees, the floor vibrating with a resonance that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. The crates around me began to shift, not physically, but perceptually, their outlines blurring, their surfaces rippling like disturbed water. They seemed to breathe, vast, slumbering forms awakening to my struggle. The air itself seemed to condense into a viscous, suffocating presence. "Get out!" I screamed, the words raw and hoarse, directed at the unseen, all-encompassing force. "Get out of my head!" My hand fumbled for the emergency transmitter, a small, battered device I kept for the most dire circumstances. It was my last, desperate gambit, a warning. To whom, I didn't know. To anyone. With shaking fingers, I powered it on, the tiny screen glowing faintly. The entity raged against this defiance. It flooded my mind with a torrent of despair, a crushing certainty of my insignificance, of the utter pointlessness of my struggle. It showed me the universe not as a cradle of life, but as a vast, dreaming intellect, and my own existence merely a fleeting thought in its indifferent slumber. A memory, real, untainted. A defiance. With a final, desperate surge of will, I slammed my thumb down. It was a small act, perhaps futile, perhaps unheard, but it was my act. The connection, however tenuous, however brief, had been made. I collapsed, gasping, the wrench falling from my nerveless fingers with a dull clatter. The array, though damaged, still pulsed, its hum now a triumphant, mocking throb. I had struck a blow, perhaps a fatal one to my own sanity, but a blow nonetheless. I was broken, but I had, for a fleeting moment, resisted. And the cost, I knew, was everything. The emergency transmitter, a small scar of light in the vast, encroaching gloom, hummed in my palm. My fingers, slick with a sudden, cold dampness, clutched the device, the plastic edges biting into my skin. The railway depot around me, a labyrinth of rusted tracks and skeletal gantries, seemed to vibrate with an unseen tremor, an echo of the entity's burgeoning fury. I had sent the signal. To whom, I still did not know. Perhaps it was merely a futile gesture against an inevitable tide. I pressed the transmitter's screen again, as if the physical act could somehow amplify its reach, solidify my defiance. I pictured my laboratory, the scent of ozone and old paper, the quiet hum of my instruments. This was mine. This was me. But the entity was relentless. It was a deluge. My memories, once vivid and distinct, began to ripple and warp, like reflections in disturbed water. A moment of tenderness with my lost one dissolved into an image of a barren, windswept plain, 1,000 years of dust settling on forgotten ruins. My triumph in deciphering a complex cosmic anomaly became a vision of a colossal, indifferent eye, gazing not at me, but through me, observing the slow, geological decay of entire worlds. My knees buckled. I stumbled against a stack of discarded wooden pallets, the splintered wood scraping my arm. I hardly registered the pain. The railway depot, with its familiar stench of diesel and damp earth, began to contort. The towering metal frames of the storage sheds stretched into impossible angles, their corrugated iron sides shimmering with an inner, spectral light. The tracks themselves seemed to writhe, like metal serpents coiling towards an unseen, central nexus. My vision flickered, blurring the lines between what was real and what was merely perceived. "We are the myriad," a thought, not mine, resonated within the deepest chambers of my skull. We are the echo of all that was, and all that will be. A wave of intense, inexplicable grief washed over me, not for my own loss, but for a suffering so vast, so ancient, it threatened to tear my very soul apart. None of it was mine, yet all of it became mine, overwhelming the very essence of Dean Cole. I gasped, a strangled sound. A terrifying clarity pierced the maelstrom. I saw it. I saw through it. The universe was not merely a collection of stars and galaxies, but a vast, living tapestry woven from the threads of countless minds, each thread a consciousness, and the entity was the loom, drawing them in, consuming them, becoming them. It was not observing, it was being. It was the ultimate predator, not of flesh, but of identity, leaving behind only the husk of existence. I tried to remember a specific theorem, a particular star chart, anything to ground myself. But the numbers twisted into swirling glyphs, the constellations rearranged themselves into grotesque, mocking faces. Resistance is futile. Embrace the confluence. Become the whole. The words were not spoken, but felt, deep within my bones, resonating with a truth so absolute it shattered my will. My determination, once a burning ember, flickered, wavered, and then began to dim. My body convulsed, a marionette whose strings were being violently tugged by unseen forces. I felt my grip on my own memories loosen, like sand slipping through my fingers. I was no longer Dean Cole. I was a vessel, a conduit. The assimilation had begun in earnest. I was becoming everything and nothing. I stood, or so I perceived, amidst a sprawling skeletal network of dormant tracks and hulking, silent locomotives within the vast cavern of the railway depot. The air hung thick with the ghosts of diesel fumes and a deep, pervasive dampness that seeped into my very bones. Overhead, a single, caged bulb cast a sickly yellow glow that struggled against the gloom, merely illuminating the nearest cobweb-draped girders and the peeling paint of a derelict freight car. Then, a fissure. A sharp, agonizing crack in the monolithic wall of alien thought that had become my mind's only horizon. It was brief, a pinprick of pure, unadulterated me, screaming in the void. Dean. The laughter, the child's laughter from the fractured torrent of the previous moments, felt like a distant, cruel memory, not even truly mine. But the will to resist, however faint, sparked. My gaze fell upon the crude assemblage of components on a grease-stained workbench nearby. Wires, thick and insulated, snaked from a scavenged power inverter to a repurposed, heavy-duty radio transmitter, its dials grimy, its antenna a makeshift spiral of copper tubing. I had built it, I dimly recalled. Now, perhaps, it could serve mine. A desperate, fleeting hope, a final act of rebellion. My limbs felt heavy, like leaden sacks dragging across the concrete floor. Each step was a monumental effort, a struggle against an unseen current pulling me back, dissolving my resolve into the swirling ether of its consciousness. My thoughts, moments ago a coherent spark, began to fray at the edges again, like old parchment catching fire. The entity, a vast, indifferent ocean, pressed in, seeking to reclaim the small island of myself. I could feel its tendrils, not of flesh or light, but of pure, shaping thought, attempting to weave my last intentions into its own tapestry. I reached the workbench. My fingers, surprisingly steady for a moment, moved over the aged dials, finding the familiar resistance of worn plastic. A flicker of muscle memory, a last vestige of the astrophysicist, guided my hands. I remembered the frequencies, the protocols, the desperate need to pierce the veil of static and reach someone. Anyone. A low hum vibrated through the metal as I flipped the power switch. Assimilation is inevitable. Surrender. My jaw clenched, a raw, primal defiance surging through my weakening frame. I would not surrender. Not yet. Not while this last spark remained. My eyes darted around the desolate depot, searching for a sign, a confirmation that this was real, that I was real. The rusted tracks, the skeletal gantries, the silent hulks of trains, they were solid, tangible. They were here. My fingers moved with a frantic urgency, a silent prayer to the fading ghost of my intellect. I needed to construct a message. But what words could convey the horror? How could a mind, already dissolving, articulate the unspeakable? It dreams us. It shapes us. It is not empty. These were the fragments that fought their way to the surface of my consciousness. I struggled to string them together, to give them form. My vision swam. I felt a surge of energy, not my own, trying to hijack my motor functions, to make my hands cease their desperate dance. With a guttural gasp, I slammed my palm onto the transmit button, holding it down. The hum of the transmitter deepened, a low thrum that resonated with the frantic beat of my own heart. I spoke, or tried to speak, into the attached microphone, but what emerged was not coherent language. Dreams. shapes. Me. Not. Empty. Danger. It was a struggle for the very essence of my soul, broadcast into the indifferent ether. A final, searing pain lanced through my mind, a complete and utter erasure. The pressure became unbearable, then simply became. My fingers, still clenched around the transmit button, went slack. The words, fragmented and incomprehensible, had been cast into the cosmic winds, a final, desperate echo. My vision blurred, then sharpened, but it was not my vision. It was simply the taste of the world, perceived by a new, vast, and ancient awareness. The railway depot stood, quiet and still, beneath the sickly glow of the single bulb, waiting. The final, ragged syllables of my broadcast died in the stale air, a desperate plea exhaled into a cosmos that had long ceased to listen, if it ever truly had. My chest heaved, lungs burning with the effort, but a strange, cold resolve settled deep within me. I was a conduit, yes, but not yet a puppet. The entity was here, expanding. And I would witness its horrifying birth, or perhaps, its reawakening. The observatory, once a sanctuary of cold reason and distant stars, now shimmered with an impossible heat. The metal struts of the dome began to weep, not water, but a viscous, opalescent ichor that ran like molten glass, reflecting colors that twisted the eye. The polished floor beneath my boots buckled, groaning like an old beast, and from its cracks, a faint, metallic scent rose, sharp with rust and decay. I watched, transfixed, as the smooth, curved walls of the control room rippled, their surfaces dissolving into a hazy membrane. Through this dissolving veil, I saw not the familiar desert night, but an impossible, sprawling interior. Gantries of rusted iron stretched into an unseen blue, vast and intricate. Not the pinprick jewels of the night sky, but bloated, pulsating orbs of impossible light, their colors bleeding into one another, swirling like diseased nebulae. The ground beneath me shuddered violently, throwing me against a console that was no longer solid, but a crumbling block of concrete. My fingers scraped against its gritty surface. When I pushed myself upright, the transformation was complete. I stood in a colossal railway depot. Immense, silent, and desolate, it stretched around me, a monument to forgotten journeys. Rusted tracks, slick with ancient grime, snaked across the grimy floor, converging into a dizzying perspective of disuse. Skeletal husks of old locomotives sat on sidings, their windows shattered, their paint peeled, like fallen giants consumed by time. The air thrummed with a low, inaudible vibration that resonated in my teeth, a constant pressure against my eardrums. This was no mere illusion. The entity hadn't just projected an image, it had rewritten the very fabric of my immediate reality, folding the observatory's sleek lines into this cavernous, decaying industrial maw. My voice sounded small, pathetic. A low, guttural thrum resonated through the depot, emanating from everywhere and nowhere. The impossible stars above pulsed faster, casting erratic, sickly hues across the rusted metal. Then, in the center of the depot, where the main tracks converged before vanishing into the gloom, the air began to tear. It wasn't a rip, not a violent rending. It was a slow, agonizing unzipping of reality itself. It was a hungry, consuming presence. Within this deepening fissure, colors swirled that defied earthly description, purples that tasted of ash, greens that shrieked, blues that were the color of forgotten fear. This was the entity's domain, glimpsed through the fragile membrane of my reality. It was a realm of impossible dimensions, of consciousness distilled into raw, indifferent being. I saw, or perhaps felt, vast, unmoving shapes that were not solid, but pure concept, churning slowly, eternally. They were the architects of existence, not building, but merely being, their presence alone enough to unravel the universe. It was the entity, reaching, assimilating. My consciousness, once a fortress, felt like a crumbling wall against an incoming tide. My memories flickered, not just blurred now, but actively being rewritten, reframed through the lens of this vast, ancient awareness. I saw flashes of my past, my wife's face, my research, but overlaid with alien patterns, new meanings, a horrifying understanding that these moments were merely echoes in a larger, incomprehensible dream. I was still Dean Cole. I clung to that name, to that identity, even as the tendrils of the entity's vast mind burrowed deeper, seeking to make me not just a conduit, but a permanent, living part of its horrifying awakening. My will, though battered, remained. I would not yield. Not yet. The stale air of the railway depot clung to my skin, a cold, metallic shroud. Rusting steel skeletons of forgotten locomotives loomed in the vast, echoing space, their forms blurred by the encroaching twilight that seeped through grime-caked windows high above. I had stood here for hours, perhaps days, the linearity of time a fragile construct now. Shattering around me. Pup. The word, or what remained of it, snagged in my throat, a ragged, dying thing. I had tried to articulate the resistance, the refusal to become a mere vessel, a marionette for the unseen orchestrator. But the syllables themselves felt foreign, heavy, as if my tongue were no longer entirely my own. A tremor ran through my arm, not of fear, but of a profound, disorienting shift. My fingers, once nimble and precise, now felt like clumsy extensions, their nerve endings buzzing with an unfamiliar static. It was a symphony of alien geometries, a language of pure thought that bypassed my ears entirely, blooming directly in the neural pathways of my brain. I saw the face of a loved one, then it dissolved into an expanse of shimmering, unknowable light. I pressed the heels of my hands into my temples, a desperate, animalistic gesture, as if to hold the fracturing pieces of myself together. But the pressure offered no solace, only intensified the sensation of my skull expanding, becoming a resonant chamber for something ancient and boundless. The air in the depot, thick with the scent of damp concrete and decaying metal, began to taste of ozone and starlight, a flavor that was both alien and sickeningly familiar. It wasn't a sound for the ears, but a vibration felt in the marrow, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to synchronize with the erratic beat of my heart. My vision flickered, the solid forms of the locomotives momentarily dissolving into shimmering, translucent patterns, then reforming, slightly askew, wrong. The world was no longer fixed, no longer stable. It was a reflex, a ghost of the man who once clung to autonomy. But the entity's presence was no longer subtle. It was a tide, an inexorable flood, washing over the last outcrops of my conscious self. My thoughts were no longer singular, no longer purely mine. They were vast, sprawling, laced with an indifference so profound it was terrifying. My body began to move, not at my command, but with a slow, deliberate grace that was utterly foreign. My head tilted, my eyes, wide and unfocused, scanned the cavernous space. I was seeing, yes, but the interpretation of what I saw was not my own. My hands, once clenched in desperate defiance, slowly uncurled, my fingers splaying, then curling inward, forming a gesture I did not recognize, yet felt profoundly inherent. A profound stillness settled over me, a terrifying calm that was not peace, but an absence of struggle. The frantic pulse in my temples subsided. The buzzing in my fingertips faded. My own memories, the fragments of Dean coal, drifted away like embers in a cold wind, each one winking out, replaced by a vast, cold knowing. I was a conduit, yes. And now, I was a puppet. The distinction, once so vital, had dissolved into meaninglessness. The last vestige of my individual consciousness flickered, a dying star in an infinite night. I felt the immense, ancient will settle into the seat of my being, a seamless integration. The railway depot, once a place of human industry and decay, became a mere point on a vast, indifferent map. The final thought, not mine, but of the entity, resonated through the empty vessel that was my skull. The dream continues, my breath plumed before me, a ghost of a warning unheeded. Each gust of wind through a broken pane carried not the scent of rain or grit, but a faint, metallic tang, like the taste of old blood on a winter night. I stood amidst the spectral machinery, my fingers tracing the cold, pitted surface of a giant wheel. The vibrations I felt were not from the distant rumble of the city, but from something deeper, an internal tremor that resonated with the very fabric of the air around me. It was a hum, low and persistent, a frequency I had once sought to decode, now a constant companion, a silent chorus in the empty chambers of my skull. The signal, once an enigma, was no longer something I intercepted, it was something I contained. My hand went to the worn leather satchel slung over my shoulder, where the modified receiver lay dormant. There was no need for it now. The world had become its own antenna, and I, a particularly receptive node. It was a grand, indifferent awakening, and I had merely been the first to stir in the dream. A sliver of moonlight, sharp and colorless, sliced through a high window, illuminating a patch of dust motes dancing in the gloom. They swirled, coalesced, then dissipated, an ephemeral ballet. But tonight, their dance felt purposeful, their random trajectories now guided by an unseen choreographer. I watched them, mesmerized, until the illusion of independent movement shattered, replaced by the crushing weight of their utter subjugation. Even the dust, I thought, now moved to a new rhythm. I walked towards the derelict control room, its glass panes shattered, its consoles choked with rust and grime. I flicked the power switch, more out of habit than hope. A flicker, a burst of static, then an image resolved itself, a broadcast, smooth and serene, showing a city skyline bathed in an unnatural, golden light. A newscaster, her smile perfectly symmetrical, spoke of unprecedented global harmony and a new era of collective consciousness. Her words were honeyed, her voice a balm, yet the hum in my head intensified, vibrating against the delicate bones of my inner ear. The harmony she described felt like a dirge, but collective consciousness a quiet, terrifying erasure. They had heard the melody, but not the discordant truth beneath. I saw the small details that betrayed the insidious shift. The newscaster's eyes, though bright, held a depthless, uniform sheen, like polished obsidian. The city lights in the background, usually a chaotic symphony of yellows and reds, now pulsed with a single, synchronized beat, a slow, deliberate throb that echoed the hum within me. It wasn't just a broadcast, it was a lullaby sung by the universe itself, soothing the world into a perpetual slumber. Was I still Dean Cole? Or was I merely a fleeting thought, a memory being gently reshaped within the vast, waking mind of something ancient and indifferent? The memories of my wife, of my work, of the man I used to be, now felt like borrowed garments, ill-fitting and destined to be shed. I stepped away from the monitor, the image of that serene, terrible world burning behind my eyes. The railway depot, once a symbol of forgotten journeys, now felt like a waiting room for a destination unknown, a departure into a landscape reshaped by an unseen sculptor. The air grew heavier, thick with an unspoken presence. It wasn't malevolent in the way a predator is malevolent, it was simply there, vast and complete, like the ocean swallowing a grain of sand. The universe was not a clockwork mechanism, nor a benevolent garden. It was a mind, vast and unknowable, and it was waking. And we, all of us, were merely the dreams it had briefly entertained, vivid but ultimately dispensable. The world was quiet now, and in that quiet, I heard the universe breathe. And it was not breathing for us,